My name is Donald Cryan. I'm the chairman of the Inner Temple History Society, and I'm very pleased to be able to welcome so many people in the lecture theatre this evening and all those online. If I could just give a brief instruction to those online who will be joining us in more or less equal numbers to those who are here, that at the end there will be a short time for questions. If you have any questions, please use the comment section of the YouTube when you've signed into it, and I will then, if I can find them, and if there are any, see if the night speaker is able to answer them for you. This is the last of an informal series on the history of the inn itself. And so far we've had talks about the 19th century fabric of the inn, about the inn's silver, about the treasures of the library, about the librarians, and this evening we're going to find out how the place was really run over the last 400 years, or possibly even longer. Looking at the gentleman up there, I rather suspect it will be slightly longer. So who better to do that than our present sub-treasurer? The present sub-treasurer, Greg Dorey CVO, is a historian, a real historian, with a rather impressive previous qualification in his early life as a historian. He then went on to become a senior civil servant and an ambassador to some really rather intriguing countries, which made me think that he could never shy away from a real challenge. And so he's here this evening. And I think probably that I won't say anything more, apart from one other thing, which is not to do with this part of the talk, but to say that after the talk, there's a really fascinating exhibition that's been put together by the archivist and the librarian. If you go up the stairs, directly out from here, it has, amongst other things, 1604 edition of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, accounts and verifications of what the speaker this evening, Greg, is going to talk about. So please don't miss it. It really is worthwhile. The only thing I would ask you to do, or two things I would ask you to do, is one, please leave your wine down here, and two, if you're tempted to, please don't touch any of the exhibits. But it's worth a walk up the stairs, I promise you. Now, over to you, Greg.
Well, Master Cryan, Donald, thank you very much both for that introduction and asking me to speak to the History Society, which I think you did almost exactly a year ago. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming, and a warm welcome to those online as well. Now, the distant origin of the role of the sub-treasurer of Inner Temple is not unknown. Geoffrey Chaucer, who's claimed with some highly dubious evidence to be a former member of this inn, himself wrote in the 14th century, late in the 14th century, so roughly around the same time that we hear for the first time in written form about Inner Temple and Middle Temple. He wrote of a gentle manciple, or maunciple, who seems to be my progenitor. And the manciple appears as one of the pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales. Now, the slide shows pages from a 1602 version of the Canterbury Tales, which is in our library and also in the exhibition upstairs. But in a modern translation, Chaucer describes the manciple as follows in his prologue. It's not very long, so I'll read it out to you. The manciple came from the Inner Temple. All caterers might follow his example in buying victuals. He was never rash, whether he brought on credit or paid cash. He used to watch the market most precisely and got in first, and so he did quite nicely. Now, isn't it a marvel of God's grace that an illiterate fellow can outpace the wisdom of a heap of learned men? His masters, he had more than 30 then, all versed in the abstrusest legal knowledge, could have produced a dozen from their college, fit to be stewards in land and rents and game, to any peer in England you could name, and show him how to live on what he had debt-free, unless, of course, the peer were mad. Or be as frugal as he might desire, and make them fit to help about the shire, in any legal case there was to try, and yet this manciple could wipe their eye. Now, I have to admit straight away that Chaucer was a bit less specific in the original than in Neville Coghill's translation, which I've just read from, and he referred more generally to the manciple coming from a temple rather than the inner temple. But inner temple probably had a manciple, and though a caricature, Chaucer may well be saying something valid about their reputation in general. Although uneducated and working for over 30 masters who are intelligent and learned in the law, Chaucer's manciple can apparently outwit them all with native cunning. Wipe their eye, meaning to defeat humiliatingly. He was particularly adept at doing deals with the archators, the Circes, or catering suppliers of their day. And unusually for him in these lines, Chaucer praises the lawyers who are working for the good of their clients and the established community. The manciple, by contrast, is a professional too, but he's working for his own selfish purposes. As we learn later in the Canterbury Tales, he's vain and pretentious, and the adjective gentle, meaning well-bred, is of course ironic. So what did the manciple look like, and how did he behave? Well, we're only told by Chaucer that the manciple has short hair, like a priest. But in the 15th century Ellesmere manuscript of the Canterbury Tales, we find an illustration on the left of the slide, which depicts him as rosy-skinned, with short hair and a beard. He looks quite well off, and we learn that he can live frugally, and he chooses not to give to the poor, even if he can afford to do so. We hear too that whether he purchases on cash or credit, he always ends up ahead in his accounts, which is a financial impossibility. The host of the pilgrims refers explicitly and sarcastically to small errors in your reckonings. The manciple is also rude to his fellow pilgrim, the cook, and tries to bribe him with drink. He's well observed in the mid-20th century painting by Polish artist Arthur Seek on the right-hand side of the slide. The flask that the manciple is holding out indicates hospitality, but you will also note that he is extremely well armed. In short, as a Victorian theatre goer watching Cleopatra once observed, how very different from the home life of our own dear Queen. Whereas the manciple had 30 masters, I have some 360 governing masters of the bench, or some 600 benches in total to outpace. So, where are the similarities between the manciple and the modern sub-treasurer? Well, he bridged the gap between the legal and the non-legal worlds. He supported his masters in practical ways, including feeding and watering them, and he derived authority from them and was trusted by them, unwisely in his case. And there the comparison ends. I certainly wouldn't risk being rude to any of our chefs. A servant of the apprentices of court, almost certainly in the temple, is mentioned as early as 1339 in manuscripts, but may have been a lowlier person than a manciple. The first references to the posts of manciple and steward appear in the London legal quarter in the 1340s and 1350s, demonstrating evidence for the establishment of collegiate legal communities at that time. And Master John Baker, who I note with a mixture of pleasure and trepidation is in the audience tonight, has noted the local coroner's records of that period suggest that the inns were then dens of violent students run by homicidal servants. Thus, the oldest known office of the Inns of Court can probably at present be said to be that of the manciple, but much had changed by the time of Henry VIII. By then, the permanent domestic establishment consisted of the steward, the butler and under-butlers, the cook, hopefully more sober than Chaucer's, and his kitchen staff, and the pannier man, not to mention the poor old boghouse keeper. Later in the 16th century, porters are mentioned, concerned with security and good order, and there was a host of lesser servants, such as laundresses, lackeys, and turnspits. The pannier man was what we now call a waiter. His function was to set the tables, to provide bread at meals, and to blow the horn for dinner. And the porters later took over that latter function, in return for a pint of beer after every performance. It doesn't help when researching these matters that all Inner Temple administrative records earlier than 1505 and all financial records earlier than 1606 are lacking. But such as they are, the records of the Inner Temple refer to a deputy treasurer of the inn as early as November 1526, and there are repeated subsequent references to such an officer from November 1557, either under the title of sub or under treasurer, both derived from the same Latin word subthesaurius. Why Inner Temple eventually settled on sub-treasurer as the appropriate title, while the other Inns of Court fixed on under-treasurer, is a moot point, possibly because we like to be different, even though the responsibilities, of course, are very similar. The first sub-treasurers were appointed ad hoc by the treasurers as their debt collection assistants and to audit their accounts, and they were benchers, so senior members of the inn, effectively performing the role of deputy or vice-treasurers. The title of treasurer and sub-treasurer clearly derived from a time when the financial element of their roles was more prominent, though that still exists in a scaled-back form. Every week, Master Treasurer and I approve the payment of all invoices for £5,000 or more. It was not until July 1682, which was somewhat later than in Middle Temple, that the Inner Temple created a standing sub-treasurer, whose duties, as then defined, were extended from time to time when business increased. It was ordered that the sub-treasurer, the steward, and the chief butler should always be appointed by the bench table, so our board of management for those unfamiliar with the term, and confirmed by a parliament, which is in effect bench table in another format. And it's since then that the sub-treasurer has formally been the principal administrative officer of the inn. The reason for the 1682 decision was probably linked to the fact that prompt payment of commons, the bench's subscriptions, had become a serious issue for the Inner Temple, resulting at times in the seizure of chambers and bonds in suit to recover arrears. The terms of reference for the sub-treasurer, which also confusingly refer to him at one point as the under-treasurer, and were based on the recommendations of a committee, were shown in detail on the slide. Sorry, I should have shown that earlier, but some staff of the inn. There's the sub-treasurer's terms of reference in 1682, and they included receiving and accounting for the inn's income, reporting defaulters to bench table, and overseeing contracts for work done and goods bought. He also had to provide sureties worth £2,000 for due performance of his duties, and that was a huge sum of money. For this, the sub-treasurer received the income shown on that slide from a variety of sources, including 5% of all of the income passing through his hands. It was a complex arrangement, and you can see that the sub-treasurer's incentive to ensure that student numbers remained high and chambers were filled at all times must have been considerable. Anthony Belbin, a member of the Society, was appointed to this restructured role, and a list of all sub-treasurers from Belbin on should have been made available to those of you attending in person. It will just help you to follow the chronology a little more easily. A further order in November 1682 required Belbin to attend every parliament of the inn and record decisions, to prepare all certificates and warrants of admittances into and out of the inn, and to supervise the butler's recording of exercises performed by members standing for call to the bar. Belbin was not in the role for long. In February 1684, he resigned his post to take up the role of the third proto-notary at the Court of Common Pleas. His final disbursements were 15 shillings for wine for bench table and a payment to the Master of the Revels for 2 nights of entertainment. In February 1685, he was called to sit at the upper mess of the bar table, and in November 1687, bench table agreed to suspend revels because he was ill and his lodging was near Hall, and he died that same year. Master Baker has surmised that his legal appointment must be connected with the fact that the then Treasurer, Sir Thomas Robinson, was chief proto-notary of the Common Pleas. Robinson himself died while Treasurer in 1683, jumping out of a window in King's Bench Walk to escape one of the many fires that afflicted the inn around this time. Not every sub-treasurer since Belbin has been a prudent sub-treasurer. He was succeeded by Thomas Riggs, a member of the Society appointed with the title Under-Treasurer, and the title of Under-Treasurer is then used all the way up till the appointment of Gascoigne Frederick as sub-treasurer in 1768, after which sub-treasurer is used consistently. But on 20th of June 1694, we read that for all his manifold defaults, Riggs is discharged from his place. On 22nd June, he was summoned to attend bench table over the money he owed and account for several sums received by him, and various legal proceedings follow. It's noteworthy that after this time, bench table seems to have signed off the accounts of all outgoing sub and under treasurers. It doesn't say in the records if Riggs was required to pay a surety or bond, so far as I've discovered, but when his successor George Wheeler was appointed, he gave a surety of £2,000 again, and essentially this guaranteed the keeping of just and true accounts of all income and expenditure, and responsibility for the safekeeping of the inn's assets, so plate, linen, deeds, rolls, admission books, and so on. In 1703, Wheeler was called to be an assistant to the bar gratis, and when he died, he was buried in the Inner Temple vault. Altogether from this time, some 8 incumbents of the role died while in harness, while several resigned due to ill health. It's a tough gig. By 1724, when Francis Peters was appointed sub-treasurer, he was required to give security in the large sum of £4,000 by 2 substantial persons with himself for the faithful discharge of his trust, and at current values that's about £1 million. This reflected both the large sums passing through his hands and the fact that until a later date, investments of the society were also made in his name. At the time of his appointment, the benchers resolved by 10-8 that in future no petition for the appointment should be read that did not come from a member of the inn admitted before the post became vacant. Peters was not a member, but a few months after his appointment was made an associate of the bar, and after his death, in 1745, his successor William Compton, a member of the society, paid only £2,000 again as surety. He held the post for less than 6 months, resigning as a result of indisposition. So how were the staff of the inn being treated then? Well, we don't know for sure, but to digress briefly, it's in the pension book of Clement's Inn for the first half of the 18th century, so roughly around this same time, that we read of a prohibition on the beating of the butler and the cook. So the fact this activity actually needed bannings suggests strongly it was not unknown. Clement's was, of course, an inn of chancery rather than an inn of court, so let's hope that Inner Temple barristers of the day were rather better behaved towards their staff. I don't propose to dwell on all the sub-treasurers between then and now, but Compton's successor, Samuel Salt, is of some interest. He was the last incumbent to be called an under-treasurer, and he was a student member of Middle Temple when admitted to Inner Temple in 1745. He occupied the post up until 1768. He also employed John Lamb as his clerk, and John, who doubled as a waiter in Hall, was the father of Charles and Mary Lamb. Charles, of course, being the author of the Old Benchers of Inner Temple in his work The Essays of Elia, which is apparently the original pronunciation, though it now tends to be rhymed with Celia. A line from the Essays, of course, features on the boy's statue in our garden. Lawyers, I suppose, were children once. Slightly dubious proposition. Salt, who treated the Lambs as if they were his own family, was called to the bar by the inn in 1753. He resigned to become an MP, but he continued to serve the inn in many roles, eventually becoming treasurer in 1788 before his death and burial in the vault in 1792. And against that background, as Master Mackinnon, who was treasurer of the inn in 1945, observed in one of his essays, it seems unreasonable that Elia made Salt out to be an absent-minded nincompoop, whose business was largely done for him by his shrewd clerk. Lamb's material's too long to read out in its entirety. I think it's also in the exhibition upstairs, but the following passage gives the flavour. S, so Salt, had the reputation of being a very clever man and of excellent discernment in the chamber practice of the law. I suspect his knowledge did not amount to much. When a case of difficult disposition of money, testamentary or otherwise, came before him, he ordinarily handed it over with a few instructions to his man Lovell, who was a quick little fellow and would dispatch it out of hand by the light of natural understanding, of which he had an uncommon share. It was incredible what repute for talents S enjoyed by the mere trick of gravity. He was a shy man. A child might pose him in a minute, indolent and procrastinating to the last degree, and yet men would give him credit for vast application in spite of himself. Well, this was clearly a caricature by the ungrateful Lamb, who noted too with amusement that mild Susan P. pursued S with unrequited passion over 40 years, Salt's first wife having died after just a year in childbirth. Lamb's accuracy is, however, thrown into question by the fact that he also thought his father a fine humorous poet, which is not borne out by his remaining works. As Master Mackinnon put it, sorrier stuff was never penned. Lamb was only 17 when Salt died. A subsequent sub-treasurer, John Spinks, is credited by Charles Lamb in a more generous mood as kindly supplementing his meagre fare when he was a pupil at Christ's Hospital. Spinks gave surety for £3,000 when appointed in 1780, as did his successor, the librarian Randall Norris, in 1801. Norris seems to have been an indifferent librarian and perhaps an indifferent accountant. After his death, an investigation of the inn's account revealed large sums due to the Norris estate. But when James Gardner, who'd been a clerk to Norris, was appointed in 1827, the surety had again dropped to £1,000. And that might have been a mistake because, as a result of poor health and domestic problems, he failed to carry out his duties properly. When Gardner died in 1833, he left substantial debts through his failure to purchase, through the stamp office, students' admission stamps and barristers' stamps for calls to the bar. A committee was formed to report on his accounts. His successor, Edward Horatio Martin, was required to find security in the sum of £2,000, the sureties to be approved by the Treasurer. I've set out the values of sureties I've come across in the table on the slide. The practice of seeking security from sub-treasurers seems to have ceased from the mid-20th century, thank goodness. This information and that on salaries is drawn from the Calendar of Inner Temple Records, which runs from 1505 to 1845, and then the Index for Bench Table Orders, which runs from 1850 to 1945. The latter starts with A for admissions and ends fittingly with W for wine. And it's completed for the most part in astonishingly neat and tidy manuscript. Much of the work of those sub-treasurers was dull. I certainly don't intend to set it out for you in any detail, but just as a random example, I came across this letter of 1st of May 1822 from Randall Norris, instructing chambers to discharge properly of their rubbish and wastewater in the proper receptacles. So not really so different from my own circulars to chambers about waste and recycling in the recent past. An 1820 map of the Inner Temple estate, a facsimile of which decorates the corridor of the 4th floor of this building, shows that at that time the sub-treasurer's residence was part of the Treasury building. In recent years, it's been a flat in paper buildings. Throughout the 19th century, those appointed as sub-treasurer were predominantly the former clerks of their predecessors. In early 1870, however, a bench table motion was passed that only those people proposed by members of bench table should be considered for the post of sub-treasurer. A committee was created to consider and select candidates for the role, and their first appointment was Henry Hall Dare, whose job description we have. It's heavily focused on financial duties and oversight, but it also covers the need to take care that the temple is properly watched and warded, and to conduct all correspondence on the business of the society. Hall Dare was followed by the appointment in 1888 of one of the more illustrious holders of the office. This was Henry Waldemar Lawrence, born in Kathmandu in 1845, and the son of Brigadier General Sir Henry Montgomery Lawrence of Siege of Lucknow fame. Our Lawrence was a barrister of Lincoln's Inn, who was later a JP for London and Surrey. He was working in the Gold Coast colony before his appointment and finding the climate there unhealthy. In 1898, he succeeded as 3rd Baronet Lawrence of Lucknow, and he died in harness in 1908. We don't know what problems he faced for sure, but in Middle Temple at that time, the Under-Treasurer was being confronted by much drunkenness amongst the staff. who were in the habit of fortifying themselves throughout the day with beer from the buttery. And it would be, I suppose, invidious to suppose that the Inner Temple staff were much better behaved. We're fortunate to have the references for all candidates for the competition won by Lawrence, which took place in 1887, and they include one from no less an individual than Field Marshal and Constable of the Tower of London, Lord Napier of Muckdullah, who's been in the media recently in connection with Ethiopian artefacts in our museums. Lord Napier states that I believe him to be a very sound and capable man of business, whose judgment I should place great reliance in. For entire fidelity and zeal in any duty entrusted to him, I can speak with the greatest confidence. As he has from an early age been in management of a commercial business, I feel sure he would be very valuable in such an office as that which he seeks. Other references in the bundle suggest Lawrence is rather overqualified for the job, though that might mean it was not seen as an illustrious role at that time. Lawrence won on a second ballot in bench table against the other remaining candidate, who was the chief clerk, Mr. J.H. Milton. Sir Henry was succeeded by Walter George Wrangham in 1908, with Milton again coming an unfortunate second in the bench table ballot. Wrangham himself had been a barrister before being appointed sub-treasurer in 1908. His son was also called by Inner Temple and was later Mr. Justice Wrangham. During the First World War, Wrangham was permitted to be seconded to the Ministry of Munitions in 1916 and to undertake part-time work at the Ministry of Food. His resignation in 1927 was accepted with regret and sympathy, presumably because he was unwell, and he was awarded a pension of £900 a year. We have a collection of references provided when Wrangham was appointed and a memorandum of his duties in the archive. Around this time, in June 1920, the nature of the ideal under-treasurer was mentioned in the Lincoln's Inn Black Books, and may give an indication of what Inner Temple also required from its sub-treasurers. He should be a university man, perhaps all other things being equal, a member of the inn, and in practical sympathy with the needs of barristers, as well as being in friendly relations with the inn's students, and able to undertake equal and friendly relations with benchers on the basis of ready and frequent meeting. They should also be a man, with knowledge and experience in the management of finance, of house property and a large establishment of servants, and have a capacity for personal care of buildings contracts, catering, duties of servants and sanitary arrangements. And Lincoln's Inn paid just £600 a year for this paragon. For courage shown by sub-treasurers, though, it would be hard to beat the record of Roy Robinson, also our longest-serving sub-treasurer, from 1927 to 1958, and previously the chief clerk, having worked his way up the ranks from originally being third clerk. Robinson, like many members of staff of Inner and Middle Temple, joined the auxiliary fire service when the Second World War broke out, and subsequently a separate fire guard for night duties at the Temple, where he supervised a joint firefighting rota. He dealt with a variety of attacks by incendiary and explosive munitions. Amongst other incidents, he helped to extinguish an incendiary device on the roof of Niblet Hall with sand and chemical extinguishers in November 1940. He and his wife Cecile displayed particular heroism as fire watchers during the worst air raid on the inn on 10th 11th May 1941, during which he sustained a bad gash in the leg but returned to firefighting, still limping, after it had been dressed. He received an honorary mention in the inn's records for bravery. This was not the first or last bombing raid on the Temple, but the devastation was immense. Except for the outer walls and vaulting, Temple Church and its contents were largely destroyed, as was the Inner Temple Treasury building. Amongst other damage, Samuel Salt's charming chambers in Crown Office Row were demolished. The boy's statue in the garden was slightly damaged and removed to a place of safety. The actual statue was stolen in the 1960s, and what we have now is sadly a fiberglass replica. Salaries of sub-treasurers seem to have remained remarkably stable over the period since the complicated arrangements made for Belbin, up till the latter part of the 20th century, as can be seen in this chart. Salt was paid a salary of about £100. When Norris was appointed in 1801, it was recorded that every stipend, salary, allowance or emolument enjoyed by the sub-treasurer do cease, and in lieu, a salary of £300 per annum be paid. He was also allowed a set of chambers and office space for free, had a grant towards the expense of employing a clerk, and was permitted to receive fees on admittances and certificates granted. For a period when the sub-treasurer role overlapped with being librarian, he received payment for that too, as he did for one-off duties, such as attending to repairs of Temple Church. In 1818, he petitioned for a higher salary and was awarded one of £400 in consideration of the length of his service, with £50 more towards the cost of a clerk, but he lost the library-related payment. In the late 20th century, as you can see, salary increases accelerated. Our archivist suggests the major increase coincided with the introduction of rents more closely aligned with the market, and she may well be right. I don't propose to delve into 21st century salaries today. As well as salaries, there were also monetary gifts for special services, bonuses, gratuities on retirement. For example, a very substantial £7,000 was given to Commander Flynn, of whom more in a minute. And for pensions and widows' pensions, for example, Cecile Robinson was awarded an allowance of £500 annually. There was a proper superannuation scheme in place by the time Robinson was sub-treasurer. And in July 1898, it had been determined that all staff be allowed luncheon to the value of £1 a day during such part of the year as the kitchen was open. This remains a much appreciated facility. Thankfully, the value of the benefit has risen over time. Until late in the 20th century, sub-treasurers would personally interview prospective new members before they were admitted to Inner Temple to see if they were fit or proper persons. The most notorious interviewer was Commander Rodney Flynn, of whom I don't have a picture, but I do have a description, because he was described by one overseas student in 1963 as a stout man with a big belly and a classic handlebar moustache turning to grey. He casually asked why I had chosen Inner Temple. That was my first test at the inn. At least that was how I felt. You will have to sit for the required numbers of dinners, Commander Flynn reminded me. He sounded like an old master. Yes, sir, I responded without thinking. The student, Nicholas Fung from Malaysia, recalled a painting in the sub-treasurer's office which depicted a fox hunting scene, which is no longer in situ. He described his dinners as comprising sumptuous and subsidised food. I have to admit that other commentators have cast doubt both on the handlebar moustache and the sumptuousness of the food. Still others describe hearing rather racist attitudes at such interviews, as well as advice to non-Muslims to sit next to Muslims at dinner because you could drink their port as well. And in an oral history interview, a member of Inner remarks that Commander Flynn certainly didn't approve of women at the bar. Master Peter Burkitt describes his admission interview with Commander Flynn thus, and I'm grateful for his permission to quote him. I came from the Lake District, which, so far as the sub-treasurer was concerned, was an almost overwhelming disadvantage. He said to me, Burkitt, I see you come from the north of England. Yes, sir, I do. I've seen your CV. It's not regular, is it? No, I'm very sorry. Have you thought about being a solicitor up there? And I said, well, I rather want to be a barrister. And then he said, this was a question you used to get asked, do you have any connections with the law? And I said, well, not really. Well, what does that mean? I said, well, I had one, but he's not still alive. Who was he? He said doubtfully. I said, he was treasurer of the inn, and he sentenced Goering at Nuremberg. And with that, I got in. You did not want to be a student in trouble with the sub-treasurers in those days up to 70 years ago. Times have changed, though my predecessor, Patrick Madams, once told an interviewer that I do, however, occasionally offer people advice. This is when you're not quite formally reprimanded. Somebody said to me they would rather have paid a £300 fine than have a word of advice from me. Commander Flynn was a tough man in other contexts too. In a letter in July 1978, he wrote to the Under-Treasurer of Middle Temple to thank him for an invitation to an amity dinner as follows. As a matter of record, I think I should point out there is no amity between us. The functions are held alternatively in our halls, but referred to as joint dinner of the inns. Our only official amity is with Gray's Inn. Might be as well if we were to avoid letting something slip into the records which has never formally existed. Well, thankfully, this bluntness does not seem to have soured the long-term relationship with our next-door neighbour. The history of sub-treasurers fighting real as opposed to metaphorical fires does not end with Roy Robinson. In 1968, Master Bill Monier Williams wrote in his copious diaries, of which more in a minute, that tonight a determined but unsuccessful attempt was made to set fire to the temple. Finally, I came across Rodney, Flynn, in Middle Temple Lane, well in charge of the situation, surrounded by police and firemen. "They've caught someone," he said, "a young chap with a little can of petrol. He was observed starting 3 fires. I asked how many fires we had had. 5, he replied. King's Bench Walk, Paper Buildings, Crown Office Row, Hare Court and Temple Gardens. That makes 10 fires altogether in the last few days." I'm indebted to Master Butler Sloss for the story of the driver whose car overshot the Inner Temple car park and was upended in a light well. Commander Flynn merely passed by, commenting as he did, "That will cost a pretty penny." On a subsequent occasion, when he crashed his car into the inn's red postbox on the corner of Paper Buildings, and there was apparently more than one such incident, a crowd swiftly gathered. A bencher present observed, "That will cost a pretty penny." It's recorded that the sub-treasurer was rescued by a former Lord Chancellor, and I'm guessing from the timing that might have been Lord Hailsham, I'm not sure. Master Monier Williams noted rather mournfully in 1976 that sadly the passing years have brought out a rather unpleasant quarterdeck attitude in my old friend Rodney Flynn, formerly Commander RN, which has manifested itself in shortness of temper and lack of tact. This has made him unpopular with bench, bar and students. Sad, because he's done so much for the inn. Later in the same year, he writes, "Also, I regret to say the welcome which students are given when they come to the Treasury to join the inn leaves a lot to be desired. Dear old Rodney Flynn has somehow got it into his head that the inn does not really need students." Master Burkitt might well share that judgment. In 1985, looking back, Master Monier Williams mentions that in his early days, Commander Flynn had effected the most remarkable reorganisation of the inn and modernised the somewhat archaic structure of the Inner Temple Treasury. But he concluded that 20 years was too long to be in situ as any chief executive. He wrote this on the evening of a farewell dinner for Rear Admiral Tom Homan, Flynn's successor, who he claimed brought with him a totally different, friendly approach, and we shall miss him. He had given some 7 years of wonderful service. In 1977, Master Monier Williams had attended the bench table that made the appointment. The treasurer of the day, Sir Basil Neild, had announced the outcome of the subcommittee's deliberations as being unanimous and commented that he went to grammar school but passed by special examination into the Royal Navy. Master Monier Williams found himself wondering whether Master Treasurer was apologising or recommending him by the conjunctive use of the word but. When he resigned in 1984, the Treasurer Stephen Brown noted he had served the inn with immense distinction and remarkable industry. In an oral history interview with a staff member, Tom Homan is described in a rather more down-to-earth language as a big burly gentleman who liked his wine. Between the appointment of Commander Flynn in 1958 and the retirement of Brigadier Peter Little, ex-Gurkha Rifles, in 2005, the sub-treasurers of the inn were all retired senior military men, the others being Rear Admiral Homan and Captain Patrick or Paddy Sheehan. And this was also true of the other Inns of Court. It was only in 2005 that the appointment of Patrick Madams turned Inner Temple into what he himself called a demilitarised zone. The others followed suit, Middle Temple in 2011 and Lincoln's Inn in 2012, except for Gray's Inn, which has stuck with the military theme right up until the present day. Their current Under-Treasurer, a former commander of the Black Watch, is entitled to wear a kilt, which I suppose is a form of diversity. Middle Temple has just remilitarised their Under-Treasurer with the appointment of a thoroughly modern Major General, and I'm delighted to see both of my dear colleagues here in the audience tonight. We know little from the written history of the reality of relations between treasurers and their sub-treasurers, except perhaps from Master Monier Williams' diaries, in which, as treasurer in 1988, he refers several times to conflict with Captain Sheehan. He writes that one of my main concerns during my readership and treasurership was the growth of a powerful bureaucracy consisting of the sub and under treasurers of the inns, working in collusion with the General Secretary of the Bar. These were on the whole retired service officers, and both individually and collectively they had strong ideas on how the inn should be run. This was particularly so in the case of the Inner Temple, and these ideas did not always tally with the views of the treasurer of the day, whose duty it was to reflect the policy of the bench. I myself came into conflict with the bureaucracy on more than one occasion, but I made sure that I, as treasurer, representing the bench of the inn, should have the final say. Master Monier Williams mentions the sinister development of the 4 sub and under treasurers meeting monthly, initiating policy, and adopting a divide and rule approach to getting it rubber stamped. He comments, Sheehan is an excellent administrator, but he does take the view that treasurers should reign but not rule. Before we know where we are, decision-making in the inns will be in the hands of our chief executives, presiding over a small cabal of their own favourites. He partly put this down to previous treasurers giving the sub-treasurer a virtual free hand. He also refers to the 4 sub and under treasurers with their power-hungry ideas. He was especially affronted at attempts to reduce the amount of student dining required, mentioning gross disloyalty, a nasty little hobby horse, and obsessional hostility by the sub-treasurer. In October, at an Inns of Court council meeting, he described the leak of a paper on the subject as a gross breach of trust. At this point, our sub-treasurer began to look very uneasy. He avoided my gaze. The sub-treasurer never questioned my authority again. But the most acute clash came in June 1988 when he wrote, "The sub-treasurer has produced some extremely foul white wine. Very sour and with a nasty taste. He really should know better. Adding insult to injury, we've stuck our own label on it. Adding further insult to injury, it's been served to the bench." This really was a try-on by the sub-treasurer in the interests of economy. It was a piece of impertinence and poor service, and he complained to the master of the cellar, who had the obvious solution. It can probably be used on student dining nights. More temperately, Master Monier Williams defined the perceived problem as follows. In the old days, the sub and under treasurer had quite an easy job to do. He had a small staff, and life in the inn treasury was a somewhat leisurely affair. Now the complex business of running an inn demands a quite different kind of person. We tend to get ex-service officers of high calibre, and they become impatient with subordinate roles. At the same time, life at the bar and on the judicial bench is becoming more demanding. In the result, more and more power passes from the benches, who are the governing bodies, to a salaried employee. We must be vigilant. Another member of the inn commented at that time that it has been my experience with every sub-treasurer since Roy Robinson that they serve the masters of the bench with unctuous charm and are pretty damned with the rest of us. On one occasion, when bench scrutineers were called for, Captain Sheehan reassured all present. May I say that I do all the work beforehand and people merely have to check it's been done correctly, which perhaps confirms Master Monier Williams' suspicions. Mildly ironically for a naval man, one of the major problems he had to deal with in his time in the inn was rampant dry rot. When he left in 1994, the then treasurer and ex-naval porters of the inn spontaneously piped him ashore, according to his later obituary. Needless to say, nothing so explicit appears in the published sources. Paddy Sheehan had been an excellent, though idiosyncratic sub-treasurer, is a quotation from one former treasurer, and that's the frankest that I've detected. And relations between the sub-treasurer and treasurer have, of course, been close to perfect since 2018, if not before. But for anyone coming from the outside world, it's interesting, to say the least, to have a new line manager every calendar year. In a small diversion from that, it was my pleasure to have Master Featherstone-Hoare as my boss for 2 years because of the pandemic, first time a treasurer had served for more than a year since Grimbald Pantsfoot in 1715 to 17. If there is a theme to the current century, it is that the role of sub-treasurer has become yet more complex and multidimensional. There's a far greater emphasis on efficiency, effectiveness and governance according to best practice, and projects have had to become more imaginative. Peter Little, I'm not sure who the South Sea Islander is in the top left-hand corner. Peter Little, as sub-treasurer, presided over the Millennium and Golden Jubilee celebrations and Treasury office and kitchen refurbishments, amongst much else. Much else included a first relaxation of the dress code in Hall, so that jackets and ties were no longer compulsory. The guidelines included the very confusing advice that underwear should not be visible and skirts should not be too short, i.e. above the knee is fine, but below the bottom is not. I think the Brigadier might be shocked by the further relaxations which have taken place since. Master Ricks, as treasurer, recorded in a valedictory for him in 2005 that Peter has perfected the art of making no sound positive and yes sound cautious. Master Staunton, another former treasurer, described him as a wise man who knew everything but said nothing. He supported every crazy idea proposed by each year's treasurer and quietly extinguished the crazy ideas of the treasurer of 2 years before. The fox hunting leitmotif had not quite disappeared by then. Master Stuart Brown recalls the letter he received from Brigadier Little after his election to Bencher in 1998. Dear Brown, congratulations on your election. Please send a cheque together with 2 photos, one passport size to allow staff to recognise you, and the other for the daybook of you in relaxed mode, hunting, shooting or fishing, for example. Master Brown sent one of himself in a wetsuit on a windsurfer, which he says never saw the light of day. Apparently Roy Robinson also took up fox hunting aged over 40 and was an enthusiastic follower of the Puckridge hounds until age 65, as I learnt from an obituary on him by no less than Mr. Justice Diplock, despite the latter being a Middle Templar. Peter Little's successor, Patrick Madams, oversaw the return of the inn to a more serious and professional education and training role. He dealt with the transformation of Sergeants' Inn into the Apex Court Hotel, handled the 2012 Olympics when the Belgian team took over in a temple, and marked the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. But more than anything else, he played a major role in conceiving of and working up to Project Pegasus, the inn's refurbishment and redevelopment project, from which we're benefiting at the moment in this our still quite new lecture theatre. I remain the first ever diplomat to be appointed to the role in any inn, and the only ever ambassador, though for a brief period, Middle Temple appointed a former diplomat as their under-treasurer. Sadly, I am the only extant sub-treasurer, or equivalent, the 25th such officer at Inner Temple. You must judge for yourself how useful the diplomatic skill set is in this context. I certainly feel it comes into play not infrequently. That said, I think that Patrick Madams still holds the title for the most geographically travelled of all sub and under treasurers while in this role. By modern Acts of Parliament, the sub-treasurer has been assigned many of the functions of a local authority. It's said in the Acts that this derives from ancient custom. Both I and my opposite number in Middle Temple are designated as local authorities with a status equivalent to the councils of inner London boroughs. Although within the City of London boundaries, we are not subject to the jurisdiction of the Mayor and Corporation of London. This derives ultimately from a bull of Pope Alexander II, dated 1163, and the privileges of the Knights Templar and Hospitaller. Under Victorian legislation, we became civil parishes for a period, for purposes such as poor relief, and until the mid-19th century, we undertook our own policing. The many payments in the inn's accounts for baptising, nursing, and apprenticing foundlings were not purely charitable. They were also to preserve the principle of extra-parochiality. Sub-treasurers, especially in the 18th century, spent considerable time and effort dealing with foundlings, many of whom were given the surname Temple. The current situation, to keep a long story short, is that we now only exercise a small number of local authority functions set out on this slide. It follows that I frequently have to respond to round-robin inquiries under the 2000 Freedom of Information Act, but only in my capacity as a local authority and not relating to information generated by Inner Temple as a private body. In most cases, this is a nil return, but for example, they have included inquiries about our boundaries, recycling statistics, and licences to show films on the premises. Finally, what do the current statutes, the bench table orders, say about the role of the sub-treasurer today? The relevant provisions seem to have been pared back over the past 140 years, but the main elements have been retained, notwithstanding a period in the 1960s and 70s when the treasurer seems to have had a more prominent role in dealing with staff misconduct. The current set of bench table orders are fairly sketchy, which is on the whole an advantage. Broadly, they say that on the recommendation of the Treasurer and Executive Committee, Parliament confirms the appointment of a sub-treasurer. The sub-treasurer attends and minutes every bench table Parliament and Executive Committee meeting. The sub-treasurer, after consulting, is responsible for engaging such staff as are necessary, and the sub-treasurer supervises the staff and reports any breach of their duties. But the statutes don't, however, mention many of my existing duties specifically. Apart from overseeing the work of the staff, they include the management, financial administration and forward planning of the inn, within a framework laid down by Bench Table and the Executive Committee. They also include maintaining relations with a variety of relevant institutions, such as the Council of the Inns of Court. Delighted to see the Director of COIC here tonight, where I'm one of the Inn's 2 trustees, and with overseas jurisdictions, particularly those in the common law world, as well as working closely with Middle Temple to ensure the smooth running of Temple Church operations. And of course managing both our COVID response and for several years implementing Project Pegasus, on which we've not quite yet closed the books. So there we have it. The sub-treasurers of Inner Temple have been around for centuries. Officers with that title started as assistant debt collectors, and they evolved into the chief executives of the inn, managing on a day-to-day basis some 150 or so excellent staff, and dealing with a hugely varied agenda. Membership services, events planning, property management, finances, gardening, catering, security, information technology, archives, library management, education and training, public relations and promotion, international relations, and so on. From the sublime to the occasionally ridiculous. Over the years, sub-treasurers have faced civil war, plague, fire, financial crises, air raids, and substantial building projects. Some have been grand and some humble, but few have been as cunning as the Manciple. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fluent, eloquent and amusing talk, and so well researched. I'm very, very grateful indeed. Before I go to questions, can I have one not of you, but of the audience here, because I know a number of us will have some recollection of Rodney Flynn.
Indeed.
I have a recollection of Rodney Flynn which does not involve that moustache. Now, can I just check, for those who have a recollection of him, who thought that he had a moustache, or a handlebar type moustache? No. No, well, history needs to be corrected on that basis.
I rather think it was you in an oral history who questioned the sumptuousness of the food as well.
Yes, that may well be right, actually. Yeah. Now, questions from the audience.
Bearing in mind I've used almost all of the material that exists. Yes.
Greg, you were the most fantastic sub-treasurer to work with. Thank you very much indeed, particularly for 2 years. And what an entertaining talk. Thank you. I just wonder, what were the sureties for? What were they trying to secure?
Well, I think it was to make sure that sub-treasurer didn't run off with the treasures of the inn, as they were at that time. The investments of the inn for quite a long period were made in the name of the sub-treasurer. And again, if they tried to claim that the money coming back from those investments belonged to them, there would have been a problem. And so a very large surety was demanded. There was a lot of business going through their hands. They handled an awful lot of money, and it was to safeguard against corruption, basically.
And that brings me on to my second question. Did they handle the rent as well?
Yes, they did.
Right.
They did.
Yeah.
and as you'd heard, at one point there were a lot of arrears in rent, which is one of the main reasons why the formal sub-treasurer job was created.
Thank you.
Somebody over there? No? Yes, gentleman up there.
Greg, thank you. What would Belbin have made of your job today?
That's an interesting question. I think, wouldn't it be great if Meredith Belbin, who is the person who wrote a lot about team theory, was actually a descendant of that Belbin and had drawn on the experience of trying to manage a group of benchers on a day-to-day basis. I think he would find that there's less of a close focus on finance all of the time. I mean, that's pretty much what Belbin would have been doing, and recording decisions. And the job is just so very, very varied. I do not know. I'm sure it's the same for you, Chris, and for Stephen sitting in the audience. You just do not know from one day to another what's going to be thrown at you. And I think that would have been the main difference.
I think my question follows on. Thank you so much for a great lecture. Obviously, it's a major CEO role now. How does that differ from CEOs in other organisations? What's distinctive about it? I know that's a wide question, but it's a very particular managerial role.
Well, there's a lot of read across from other senior jobs.
Yeah.
Having been an ambassador abroad, I sort of feel I'm using the same skill set, but in an entirely different environment. But of course, it is ultimately here a member-led organisation, and it's the members that are setting the framework within which one operates, and you have to remember that all the time. And it sounds as if Paddy Sheehan didn't always remember that in his day. So the decisions you take are to a degree constrained by the agreements that have previously been reached and the statutes and the rules which are in place. So in some ways you don't have as much of a free hand as chief executives in some organisations, but then you're the person on the spot when it all goes horribly wrong, and you've just got to deal with it at that moment in the best way that you possibly can.
Thank you.
Anything else? Yes. Cryan.
Just a little Rodney's Flynn quip. He came into lunch one day and said, "I've just reversed into the street light in the parking lot. I'm having it removed tomorrow."
There's an oral history which was provided by a member of staff, which I didn't quote earlier, who said that they thoroughly enjoyed life at the inn, but Commander Flynn was the only fly in the ointment. He liked to make life difficult for the employees. He was rather fly in as much as he wanted to run the inn his way, and really the treasurer runs the inn. So to keep the treasurer out of the way, Commander Flynn would say, "Next year, when you're treasurer, we really are having a problem with the accommodation here. It needs a complete and thorough review. You wouldn't like to look into that, sir, would you?" "Oh, good idea, Flynn. Yes, I'll do that." And they became so engrossed in that, they couldn't be bothered with all the rest of the running of the inn, which left Commander Flynn to do what he liked.
Well, Greg, I don't think there are any other questions, and I can't see any online. But that really doesn't diminish what a wholly entertaining and informative talk that was. Thank you so much.